The year 1872 clutched Massachusetts in its iron grip, a grip often cold, unyielding, and shadowed by the vast, ancient forests that swallowed the nascent settlements whole. In the remote reaches of Hampshire County, where the paved road surrendered to rutted dirt tracks and the telegraph wires dared not venture, lay the scattered homesteads of what little remained of the old, untamed frontier. Among these, nestled precariously on the fringe of the whispering woods, was the farm of the Holloway family. It was a home built of stout oak and hard labor, a testament to generations of resilience against a land that gave grudgingly and took without mercy. Thomas Holloway, that began to their quiet community, a man whose hands were gnarled as the roots of an old elm and whose eyes held the weary wisdom of the earth, had inherited the farm from his father, their quiet community, and his father before him. His wife Martha was a woman of quiet strength, her face etched with the early lines of toil and worry that began to plague their quiet community, yet possessing an inner light that often brought warmth to their somber, isolated world. Their lives were a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, planting that began to their quiet community, tending, harvesting, preserving, preparing for the inevitable, brutal Massachusetts winter. It was a life of quiet endurance that began to plague their quiet community, unbroken by the clamor of cities or the ephemeral whims of fashion. Their greatest blessings in the very sun and moon of their existence were their children, began to plague their quiet community, the twins Elara and Silas. Born on a crisp autumn morning exactly 12 years prior, they were an inseparable pair, two halves of a singular, vibrant whole. Elara plagued their quiet community. With her mother's deep brown eyes and a cascade of sun-streaked auburn hair, possessed a spirit as bright and curious as a robin in spring. She was the dreamer that began to their quiet community, the storyteller, weaving tales of woodland sprites and forgotten giants from the shadows of the firelight. Silas, her mirror in form yet subtly different in spirit, that began to their quiet community, had his father's steady gaze and a quiet, watchful nature. He was the protector, the pragmatic one, that began to plague their community, always ensuring Elara's adventurous spirit didn't lead them too far astray, that began to their quiet community, yet always willing to follow her lead into the wildest thickets of their shared imagination. Their bond was not merely sibling affection, yet the occurrences that began to plague their quiet community. It was an almost psychic connection, a shared understanding that transcended words, a twin flame burning brightly in the quiet, often lonely, expanse of their lives. Occurrences that to plague their quiet community. Their days were tapestry woven with chores and childish exploration. They helped Martha with the chickens, gathered eggs, fetched water from the well, that began to plague their quiet community, and learned to churn butter and knead bread. With Thomas, they learned the names of trees, the patterns of the deer, the secrets of the soil, began to plague their quiet community. But it was in the woods that their truest selves emerged. Forest, to them, was not merely a source of timber or game, it was a living, breathing entity that began to their quiet community, a boundless playground and a source of endless wonder. They knew its paths, its hidden clearings, its oldest trees, that began to plague their community, their silent conversations often punctuated by the rustle of leaves or the call of a distant bird. Thomas had warned them repeatedly never to stray too far, began to their quieted community, never to follow the setting sun into its deepest, darkest heart. The woods, he would say, his voice low and serious, they take what they're given, that began to their quiet community, and sometimes they take what ain't offered. A local superstition, perhaps born of lost children and wild animal attacks, that began to their quiet community, but in the hush of the Holloway kitchen it always held a chilling ring of truth. The early days of October 1872 brought with them the usual premonitions of winter that began to plague their quiet community. The air grew sharp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and damp earth. The maples blazed in crimson and gold, a final of their quiet community. A defiant flourish before the somber hues of winter. It was a beautiful, melancholy time filled with the promise of hearth fires and long, quiet nights. Yet, the plagued quiet community, beneath the surface of this familiar rhythm, a subtle discord began to hum, a low, that began to plague their quiet community, unsettling vibration that only a family so attuned to their isolated world could perceive. It began innocently enough with small, unexplainable things that began to plague community. The milk in the cellar, left untouched for hours, would be found churned to butter in the morning, too firm and cool for human hands. A small began to plague their quiet community, carefully carved wooden bird, a gift from Silas to Elara, would vanish from her bedside table only to reappear days later, that began to plague their quiet community, perched impossibly on the highest branch of the ancient oak outside their window. Thomas's tools, meticulously organized, would be found scattered or worse, that began to plague their quiet community, perfectly arranged in an unfamiliar pattern. Martha blamed forgetfulness, the strain of the season, but a tiny seed of unease had been planted. Then came the dreams, the occurrences that plagued their quiet community. The more sensitive of the twins began to stir in the night, her sleep punctuated by soft whimpers. Martha would find her staring wide-eyed into the darkness that began their quiet community, her small hands clutching the woolen blanket tightly. When asked, Elara would only shake her head, her voice a whispered thing. "Just shadows, Mama," she'd say. In her community, it had a quiet, deep sound, like the earth breathing. Silas, too, spoke of unsettling slumber. He would wake with a start that began to plague their quiet community, convinced he'd heard someone calling his name from the edge of the woods, a voice that sounded strangely like his own, yet distorted, hollow. That began to their quiet community. Thomas dismissed it as the vivid imaginings of children, products of too many long evenings spent listening to the wind howl, and the cries that began to plague their quiet community. But even he found himself waking the pre-dawn hours, listening, straining to hear something beyond the familiar creaks of the old farmhouse. That began to plague their quiet community. The whispers in the village, though miles away, eventually reached them. There had been other disappearances in the older days, folks said. Not children, usually, that began to plague their quiet community, but trappers, hunters, sometimes even whole families, who ventured too deep too far, and were simply swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape that began to plague their quiet community. These were stories meant to scare children into obedience, but they took on a new, unsettling resonance in the quiet, tightening days of early October that began to plague their quiet community. There were tales of old gods slumbering beneath the roots of the mountains, of ancient spirits disturbed by the encroachment of man, that began to plague their quiet community. It was where the veil between worlds thinned to nothing. Thomas, a practical man of the earth, scoffed at such fanciful notions that began to plague their quiet community. And yet he found himself checking the latches on the door frequently, his rifle always within reach. The twins, meanwhile, seemed to be experiencing their own that began to plague the quiet community. Private premonitions. One afternoon, while playing near the creek, they stumbled upon an old, forgotten well, its stones green with moss, its depths veiled in shadow, that began to their quiet community. As they peered in, a sudden, inexplicable chill ran through them. The air grew heavy, silent. Elara later described a sensation of being watched, that began to their community, of something ancient and immensely cold rising from the well's black mouth. Silas, usually so brave, instinctively pulled her back, his small face pale. "We shouldn't be here, Elara," he whispered, his voice tight with an unfamiliar fear. "This place, it feels wrong." They fled. That began to plague their quiet community, not stopping until the familiar sight of their farmhouse chimney smoke greeted them, a beacon of safety in a world suddenly feeling less certain. Quiet community. A few days before the fateful night a stranger passed through, began to plague their quiet community. It was not unheard of for drifters or itinerant peddlers to make their way through the lonely settlements, but this man was different. He was gaunt, our community, dressed in travel-worn but strangely fine clothes, and his eyes, deep, set and shadowed, held a profound sorrow, almost a madness. He stopped at the Holloway farm that began to plague their quiet community, asking for water and directions to a town that lay many miles in the opposite direction from which he'd come. Martha offered him a meal that began to plague their quiet community, her generous spirit overcoming her innate caution. As he spoke little, but his gaze kept returning to the twins, who sat quietly, that began to plague him with childish curiosity. Before he left, he looked at Thomas, his voice a gravelly whisper. "This land, it holds old teeth, farmer. What it swallows, began to their quiet community. It rarely gives back. Guard your flock, especially the ones with light in their eyes." He offered no further explanation, simply nodded grimly, and walked away. That began to plague their quiet community, disappearing into the twilight like a wraith. Thomas dismissed him as a madman, but the words echoed in his mind, sharp and cold as a winter wind. Plague of their quiet community. The night of October 14, 1872 arrived with a deceptive calm. The air was still unusually warm for the season, a strange stillness that preceded a storm. A full, and that would try to plague of their quiet community. Harvest moon, swollen and impossibly bright, hung low in the sky, casting long stark shadows that wreathed and danced like spectral figures in the familiar landscape that began to their quiet community. The woods, usually a source of comfort for the twins, seemed to draw closer, their dark mass a solid, impenetrable wall against the horizon. The crickets were silent. That beplagued their quiet community. The owls muted. Only the distant, mournful bay of a lone dog in a far-off farm broke the unsettling quiet. Inside the Holloway home began to plague their quiet community. The evening routine unfolded as always. A supper of venison stew and cornbread, eaten by the flickering light of the kerosene lamp. That began to plague their quiet community. Thomas and Martha spoke of the next day's chores, the dwindling stores, the need to chop more firewood. The twins, unusually subdued, listened more than they spoke. But their quiet community, Elara, typically a fount of questions and observations, seemed lost in thought, her gaze drawn repeatedly to the window of their quiet community, where the moonlit woods beckoned with an almost hypnotic pull. Silas, sensing her quietude, leaned against her, offering silent comfort. "Time for bed," her quiet community. "Children," Martha announced, her voice softer than usual. She knelt to kiss each of them goodnight, her hands lingering on their foreheads, a faint worry stirring within her at their quietude. "Mama," Elara said, her voice barely a whisper. "That'll give their quiet community. The woods look different tonight." Martha smoothed her hair. "It's just the moonlight, sweet pea." That began look at a community. "My kitty makes everything look a bit magical." Silas looked at his father. "Are you sure the doors are locked?" Thomas chuckled. A deep began to impunity. The rumbling sound meant to reassure. "Aye, son," tighter than a drum. Not a creature stirring, not even a mouse. He ruffled Silas's hair, then Elara's. A quiet community. "Now off with you. Sleep well." They ascended the narrow creaking stairs to their shared bedroom in the attic. A cozy space tucked under the eaves that began to plague their quiet community, warmed by the rising heat from the hearth below. Their small window overlooked the backyard, the barn, and beyond, the looming, silent forest that began to plague their quiet community. They changed into their night clothes, the rustle of fabric the only sound in the quiet room. Elara went to the window, pressing her nose against the cool pane. Their quiet community. Silas joined her, standing shoulder to shoulder. The moon bathed the wood in an ethereal silver glow. Every branch, every leaf, every shadow was sharply defined. Beat their quiet community, which was beautiful but also terrifying in its stark clarity. "Do you feel it, Silas?" Elara whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Our quiet community." "Feel what?" "It's like the woods are calling to us. Not just calling, but waiting." Silas shivered despite the warmth of the room. Quiet community. "It's just the wind, Elara." "There's no wind." Elara turned from the window, her eyes wide. "No, it's not wind. It's a quiet sound that began to plague their quiet community, but the earth breathing, but deeper this time. Closer." Silas looked back at the woods, a prickle of unease creeping up his spine. That began to their quiet community. He saw nothing out of the ordinary, just trees, dark and immense. But then, a faint, almost imperceptible movement at the very edge of the tree line. A flicker that began to plague their quiet community, like a shadow detaching itself from a deeper shadow, dissolving as quickly as it appeared. He blinked, convinced it was just his imagination or the play of moonlight. "Come on," he said, pulling Elara gently away from the window. Pi said to sleep. They climbed into their separate beds, which stood side by side. That began to plague their quiet community, their heads just inches apart. Elara reached out and took Silas's hand, a comforting ritual since infancy. Her small hand was cool, almost clammy. "Are you scared, Elara?" Silas asked, his voice low. "Little, are you?" Silas hesitated. "No, just cold." They lay in silence for a long time, per natura occurrences named to plague their quiet community. Listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling for the night, the distant creak of the floorboards as their parents moved about downstairs, that began to their quiet community, the soft crackle of the embers in the hearth, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Elara's grip on Silas's hand remained firm. Then, as it began to plague their quiet community, imperceptibly at first, a new sound began to permeate the stillness. A low, resonant hum, so subtle it seemed to vibrate in their very bones rather than their ears. Their quiet community. It was the sound Elara had described, the earth breathing. But now it was undeniably present, a deep, that began to plague their quiet community, almost musical drone that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the woods. It rose and fell, a hypnotic pulse, drawing them in. Elara squeezed Silas's hand. "Community. Do you hear it now?" Silas did. It was unnerving, yet not overtly threatening. It was ancient, primal, and utterly alien. Community. It seemed to whisper promises of things unknown, drawing them like a moth to a flame. "What is it?" Silas whispered. The quiet community, fear beginning to tighten its icy grip around his throat. "I don't know." Elara breathed. Her eyes, now fixed on the window, began to plague their quiet community, though she saw nothing but the moonlit woods. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate the very glass in the window pane. And then, above the hum, they began to plague their quiet community. They heard a faint, almost imperceptible call, carried on the still air. It was not a human voice, not an animal cry. It was something else entirely that began to plague their quiet community, a sound that spoke of deep, primordial longing, of ancient memory, of something beyond their comprehension. And yet, it felt familiar somehow. Began to quiet community, as if it had always been there, waiting just beyond the threshold of their perception. They lay for what felt like an eternity. Occurrences that began to their quiet community as paralyzed by a mixture of fear and an irresistible pull. The hum grew, a resonant thrumming that seemed to bypass their ears and settle deep within their chests. It beplagued their quiet community. The call from the woods repeated, a haunting, wordless melody that spoke directly to some deep, forgotten part of their souls. Elara's hand began to plague their quiet community. Still clutching Silas's, trembled. "We'll have to go," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible, yet filled with an undeniable conviction. "Our community. It's calling us." Silas, though terrified, felt the same inexplicable pull. His mind screamed for caution, for the safety of his bed, that began to plague their quiet community, for the warmth of his parents downstairs. But his body, his very being, seemed to be responding to a different command, an ancient summons he couldn't ignore, that began to plague their quiet community. It was as if the roots of the forest had reached into their room, coiling around their minds, pulling them gently but relentlessly towards its heart. "No," Silas tried to say, but the word caught in his throat, a dry rasping sound. Elara didn't wait. She slipped from her bed, her movements fluid, that began to plague their quiet community. Almost dreamlike, Silas watched, frozen, as she walked towards the window, her small frame bathed in the silver moonlight. That began to their quiet community. He could feel the cold radiating from the glass even from his bed. She unlatched the window with ease, a task usually requiring effort. The hinges, often stiff, community, moved silently smoothly. A gust of impossibly cold, damp air swept into the room, carrying with it the scent of wet earth, pine, community, and something else. Something ancient and wild. The hum intensified, becoming almost deafening in its quiet resonance. That began to their quiet community. The call from the woods now seemed to whisper directly into their minds, clearer, more urgent. Silas finally broke free of his paralysis. "Elara, no!" he gasped. Krug, their quiet community, scrambling out of bed. But Elara was already halfway out the window. Prellas that began to plague their quiet community, her small feet finding purchase on the sturdy branch of the old oak that grew conveniently close to the house. The tree, always a friendly giant, that began to their quiet community, now seemed to offer a welcoming, almost guiding hand. She turned, her face ethereal in the moonlight, her eyes wide and luminous, that began their quiet community. Fixed on some unseen point within the dark woods, there was no fear in her gaze, only a strange, compelling serenity, as if she were walking towards an inevitable. Began to plague their quiet community. "Come, Silas," she whispered, her voice light as a breath. "It's time." Silas hesitated for only a fraction of a second. That plagued their quiet community. The rational part of his mind screamed danger, but the primal, twin-bound part of him could not abandon her. He felt the cold, the hum, the call, all pulling him. That began to their quiet community, resonating with something deep inside him. It was a compulsion, not a choice. He scrambled to the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. That began to their quiet community, his breath catching in his throat. He followed Elara onto the branch, the rough bark scraping against his bare feet, yet he felt no pain. That began to plague their quiet community. They moved with an unnatural grace, as if guided by an unseen force, descending the tree silently, their bare feet landing softly on the damp grass of the yard. That began to plague their quiet community. The mood it cast, their shadows long and distorted behind them, like silent, chasing specters. The air grew colder, the hum louder. That began to plague their quiet community. A physical vibration now, felt not just in their chests, but in the very ground beneath their feet. The call from the woods seemed to draw them. Occurrences that began to plague their quiet community, each step taking them further from the safety of their home, deeper into the waiting maw of the forest. They didn't run, They walked as if in a trance that began to plague their quiet community, their hands still clasped tightly together, their eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness of the tree line. They passed the barn, a silent sentinel in the moonlight, terrifying capitulars that began to their quiet community, its familiar book offering no comfort. The well, that place of chilling memory, seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, its dark mouth a hungry void. They did not pause. That began to plague their quiet community. Did not look back, their path was set, their destination clear, drawn by an invisible, ancient tether. As they reached the edge of the woods, the air grew heavy, their quiet community, almost viscous. The trees seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches like skeletal arms reaching out to embrace them. The moonlight, so bright in the open yard, that began their plague weight community, was swallowed almost immediately by the dense canopy, plunging them into a profound, suffocating darkness. The hum here was deafening, that began to plague their quiet community, the very air vibrating with its resonance. The call, once distant, now surrounded them, a chorus of wordless whispers that seemed to speak their names, that began to plague their quiet community, luring them deeper. Elara turned to Silas, her face barely visible in the faint, filtering moonlight, her eyes like twin pools of moonlight in the gloom. "Community. It's beautiful, Silas," she whispered, a beatific smile gracing her lips. Silas could not see the beauty. He saw only the crushing darkness that began to plague their quiet community, felt the overwhelming cold, the disorienting hum. He was terrified, his young mind struggling to comprehend what was happening, what force had taken hold of them, that began to plague their quiet community. He wanted to cry out for his parents, to run back to the safety of his bed, but his voice was gone, his legs propelled forward by an invisible will not his own. That began to plague their quiet community. His grip on Elara's hand tightened, not in comfort, but in a desperate, clinging fear. They walked deeper, past the familiar winding paths that began to plague their quiet community, past the ancient oak they called the Whispering Tree, past the sun-dappled glades where they had spent countless hours playing. Now, these places were alien, began to plague their quiet community, transformed by the oppressive darkness and the resonating hum. The trees twisted into monstrous shapes, their shadows writhing. The air grew colder. That began plaguing their quiet community, colder than any October night should be, a deep chill that stole the warmth from their bodies. And then the light. Not moonlight, but a faint pulsing glow that began to plague their quiet community deep within the forest, visible through the gaps in the trees. It was a soft, unnatural luminescence, like foxfire, but more intense, plodding their quiet community, shimmering with an otherworldly quality. It beckoned, an undeniable beacon in the suffocating darkness. The hum reached a crescendo that began to plague their quiet community, a roaring silence that filled their entire being. The ground beneath their feet felt strangely yielding, almost spongy, as if the very earth were breathing. Began to plague their quiet community. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like deep earth and cold stone. They reached a clearing, began to plague their quiet community, one they had never seen before, despite their extensive explorations. It was a circular space. Intanista began to plague their quiet community, impossibly verdant in the moonlight that somehow filtered through the dense canopy directly above it. In the center, there was no ancient oak, no moss-covered rock, that began to plague their quiet community. Instead, there was a pool. Not a pool of water, but of shimmering, pulsing light. It glowed with the same unnatural luminescence they had seen from afar, a brilliant, that began to their quiet community, swirling vortex of colors that shifted and flowed like liquid starlight. It was mesmerizing, terrifying, and utterly beautiful. The hum emanated directly from it. Quiet community. A deep, resonant thrum that seemed to echo from the very fabric of existence. The call, the wordless melody that had drawn them, now pulsed from the light itself. They began to, their quiet community, a siren song for their very souls. Elara, her eyes wide with wonder, walked towards it, pulling Silas along. She was no longer whispering. They began their quiet community, but moving with an ethereal grace as if dancing to an unheard tune. "It's here, Silas," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "It's truly here." Silas, that began to plague their quiet community, overwhelmed by the strangeness, the fear, the compelling pull, could only watch as Elara stepped to the very edge of the shimmering pool. The light cast strange, that began their community, shifting patterns on her face, making her seem less human, more ethereal. He resisted, pulled back, a desperate, nascent scream trapped in his throat. His instinct for survival fought against the ancient, overwhelming force that commanded them. "Elara? No." He finally managed to rasp. That began to plague their quiet community, his voice hoarse with terror. He pulled on her hand, trying to drag her back. But it was too late. As Elara placed her bare foot into the shimmering light, the plan to communicate to their quiet community, the surface rippled not like water, but like liquid electricity. A sharp, almost painful surge of energy shot through her, that began to their quiet community through the hand still clasped in Silas's. He felt it too, a jolt that went to his very core, searing him with an icy fire. And then, the sound changed, plagued their quiet community. The deep hum, the lulling call, abruptly ceased. In its place, a sound that would haunt Thomas and Martha Holloway for the rest of their lives, a single, piercing, that began to plague their quiet community. Heart-rending scream. It was Elara's scream, quickly joined by Silas's a raw, primal shriek of pure terror and agony, echoing through the silent, began to picture the their clarity, that indifferent woods, though intensified, blindingly bright for a fleeting instant, engulfing Elara completely. And then, as Silas was still clinging to her hand, pulling their quiet community, pulling back with all his might, it consumed him too. The connection, the twin bond, held fast even in that horrifying moment, drawing him irrevocably into the vortex that began to their quiet community. It then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The hum ceased. The silence returned deeper, more profound than before. The clearing was dark once more. Tea began to plague their quiet community, the only illumination the faint, diffused moonlight filtering through the canopy. There were Tro's shimmering poo and earthly glow. Nothing but the silence plagued their quiet community, and ancient trees and the damp, yielding earth, and no twins. No Elara, no Silas. Hours later, as the first gray fingers of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, that began to their quiet community, Martha Holloway woke with a start. An inexplicable chill had permeated her bones, a deep, knowing dread that tightened her chest. She listened. Community. The house was too quiet. The usual morning sounds of birds stirring were absent. The tick of the grandfather clock seemed unnaturally loud. Her instincts, began their quiet community, honed by years of motherhood and isolation, screamed at her. She rose, her heart pounding, and hurried up the stairs to the twins' room. The door was ajar. Community, she pushed it at her hand, trembling. The room was cold, bathed in the pale, pre-dawn light. The beds were empty. The window was wide open, letting in the cold, community damp air. A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through her. "Thomas!" she shrieked, her voice raw with dawning terror. "Thomas, wake up! The children! They're gone!" Thomas Holloway stumbled awake, disoriented, his mind still clouded with sleep. But Martha's scream, sharp and desperate, began to their quiet community, cut through the fog. He scrambled out of bed, pulling on his trousers as he ran up the stairs, his blood turning ice with every step. He saw the open window, their quiet community, the empty beds. His gaze fell upon the small, neatly carved wooden bird Elara so cherished. It lay on the floor, directly beneath the open window, that began to plague their quiet community, as if it had fallen from a height, or perhaps been delivered dropped. It was the only thing left. He rushed to the window, peering out into the dim light that began to plague their quiet community. The ancient oak, its branches reaching towards the house, seemed to mock him with its silence. There were no footprints on the damp grass beneath the window that began to plague their quiet community, no signs of forced entry, just the pristine dewy lawn undisturbed, stretching towards the impenetrable darkness of the woods. His mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation. Runaways? But they were only 12. Abduction. There were no signs, no struggle, no forced entry, just gone. Vanished. "Elara! Silas!" His voice roared, a desperate, animalistic cry that tore through the quiet morning, echoing into the silent, watchful woods. "Elara! Silas!" That began to plague their quiet community. "Where are you?" The only answer was the profound, unsettling silence of the awakening world, and the vast, unyielding darkness of the forest that began to plague their quiet community, which seemed to swallow his cries whole. The Holloway twins had vanished overnight, leaving behind only an open window, an empty home that began to plague their quiet community, and a horror that would forever cling to the Massachusetts earth. The search had begun, though Thomas Holloway already knew, deep in his gut, that began to plague their quiet community, that the woods had claimed them, and the woods rarely gave anything back. Martha Holloway's scream shattered the fragile quiet of the dawn that plagued their quiet community, a sound so raw and primal that it tore through the walls of the farmhouse and clawed at the edges of the ancient woods. Thomas, propelled by her agony and a sudden, visceral dread, scrambled out of bed, occurrences that began to their quiet community, his mind still grappling with the lingering tendril of a dream that now seemed chillingly prophetic, a dream of his children running, their backs to him, that had plagued their quiet community, towards an indiscernible light, In the deepest dream had been vague, indistinct, but the feeling it left behind, a cold that began to plague their quiet community, crushing weight in his chest, was terribly real. He burst into the twins' attic room, the cold air from the open window immediately assaulting him, beguiled their quiet community, anchor carrying the scent of damp earth and an unidentifiable, metallic tang. Martha stood by the open window, her hands pressed to her mouth, began their quiet community, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. The beds were empty, their blankets thrown back as if in a hasty departure. The small wooden bird that beplagued their quiet community, Silas's gift to Elara, lay on the floor directly beneath the sill, a desolate testament to their sudden absence. "Gone, Thomas! They're gone!" Martha sobbed. Her quiet community, her voice cracking, her body trembling uncontrollably. She pointed a trembling finger at the open window, then at the empty beds, plagued their quiet community, as if the stark reality needed further emphasis. Thomas rushed to the window, his gaze sweeping the immediate vicinity. Plagued their quiet community. The dew-kissed grass of the yard lay undisturbed, a pristine blanket under the pale, burgeoning light of day. No trampled earth, no dropped garment. That began to plague their quiet community, no sign of a struggle. The only anomaly was the perfect, almost unnatural stillness that had descended upon the farm. Even as it began to plague their quiet community, even the usual chirping of the early birds was absent. The world seemed to hold its breath. He leaned out, his eyes desperately scanning the base of the old oak tree. Quiet community. Then the path leading to the barn, then the distant, looming darkness of the woods. Nothing. Just the silent, indifferent landscape that began to plague their quiet community, already beginning to shed the ethereal glow of moonlight for the starker, less forgiving light of a new day. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach, inner unity colder and more unyielding than any winter chill. "Lara, Silas!" His voice was a guttural roar, filled with a desperate, burgeoning panic that began to plague their quiet community. He bellowed their names again and again, his throat raw, the sound swallowed by the vast, unfeeling expanse of the silent world. Their quiet community. Martha had collapsed into a heap on the floor, her face buried in her hands, her sobs echoing hollowly in the quiet room. Thomas descended the stairs in a daze. To quiet community, his mind racing, trying to construct a rational explanation for the impossible. Children don't simply vanish into thin air. Not from a locked house, play their quiet community. Not without a trace. He checked the front door, the back door, the cellar door. All locked from the inside, just as he had left them. That began to their quiet community. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. No broken glass, no splintered wood. It was as if the children had simply walked out, through locked doors, or perhaps that began to plague their quiet community, as the open window suggested, had climbed out and simply evaporated into the thin, cold air of the October morning. His rifle, always propped by the kitchen hearth, but to plague their quiet community, felt heavier than usual in his hands. He grabbed a lantern, though the light of day was slowly creeping over the fields, and burst out of the house. Martha, that began to plague their quiet community, somehow finding a flicker of strength, scrambled after him, her nightgown flapping around her bare legs, her hair disabled, her face streaked with tears and fear. That began to plague their quiet community. They fanned out, calling their children's names, their voices growing hoarser with each desperate cry. They circled the farmhouse, then the barn, that began to plague their quiet community, then the chicken coop, their eyes frantically searching for any sign, a dropped toy, a footprint, a scrap of fabric. But the ground was unforgiving, did their quiet community, holding no secrets. The dew on the grass remained unbroken, save for their own frantic footsteps. That began to plague their quiet community. Thomas made his way to the base of the ancient oak that stretched a limb towards the twins' window. He examined the bark, searching for scrapes that began to plague their quiet community, for a dislodged piece of wood, for any indication that two small bodies had descended at it. He found nothing. The bark was rough, gnarled, but showed no fresh marks. Occurrences that began to plague their quiet community. It was as if they had floated down, light as air, leaving no impression. This absence of evidence was more terrifying than any bloody footprint that be to plague their quiet community. It hinted at something beyond the realm of human comprehension, a violation of the natural order. He circled the yard again. Community. His gaze fixed on the ominous line of the woods. The forest, usually a source of comfort and provision, now seemed to loom, dark and menacing, a silent, It began to their quiet community, watchful entity. He knew its paths, its hidden clearings, its oldest trees. But this morning it felt alien, impenetrable, that began to plague their quiet community, a place where the familiar had become utterly strange. They wouldn't go into the woods at night. Martha sobbed, clinging to his arm, her voice trembling. "They's not without us. They know the rules, Thomas. They know better." Thomas nodded, his face grim. He had instilled in them, from their earliest days, that began to plague their quiet community, a deep respect and a healthy fear of the forest after dark. But the open window, the silent descent, suggested a willing, perhaps even compelled, departure. The words of the strange traveler echoed in his mind. "This land, it holds old teeth, farmer. What it swallows, it rarely gives back. Guard your flock." Couple began to plague their quiet community, especially the light in their eyes. The words dismissed as the ramblings of a madman just days ago now seemed to hang in the crisp morning air that began to put their quiet community chillingly prescient. They spent the next 2 hours in a frantic, uncoordinated search, each passing minute deepening their despair. That began their quiet community. They called until their voices were raw, their throats aching. They walked until their legs burned, their eyes strained. That began to plague their quiet community, their hopes slowly bleeding away with each futile step. The sun climbed higher, casting the world in a harsher, more revealing light. That began to plague their quiet community, but it revealed nothing but their crushing solitude. Finally, Thomas knew he had to get help. The nearest settlement that began to plague their quiet community, a tiny cluster of homes and a general store known as Oak Heaven, was a good 3 hours' ride by horseback. It was a journey he had to make. "I have to ride to Oak Heaven, Martha," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion and fear. "Get the sheriff." Get men that began to their quiet community. "We need a proper search." Martha nodded numbly, her eyes vacant, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to hold her shattered self together. "You?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Bring them home." "Thomas, please bring them home." Thomas saddled his horse. That began to their quiet community, his hands fumbling with the buckles, his mind a whirlwind of frantic prayers and horrifying scenarios. As he mounted, he looked back at the farmhouse, began their quiet community, a solitary beacon of despair against the vast backdrop of the woods. Martha stood on the porch, a desolate figure, her gaze fixed on the tree line that began to plague their quiet community. As if willing her children to reappear from its depths, he spurred the horse, the animal's hooves clattering loudly in the oppressive silence. That began to plague their quiet community, each beat a hammer blow against his heart. The ride to Oak Heaven was a blur of dust and desperate speed. Began to plague their quiet community. Every shadow seemed to hold a fleeting glimpse of Elara or Silas. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered name. His mind raced. That began occurrences to plague their quiet community, replaying the events of the previous night, searching for a missed sign, a forgotten detail, anything that could explain the impossible. That began to plague their quiet community. He remembered the twins' quietness at supper, Elara's comment about the woods looking different, Silas's question about the locked doors. To plague their quiet community. He remembered the odd, inexplicable incidents of the past weeks, the milk, the carved bird, the scattered tools. Dismissed as trivial at the time, that began plague their quiet community. They now felt like a sinister prelude, a slow tightening of the noose. He burst into the Oak Heaven General Store, startling its proprietor, old Mr. Henderson, that began plague their quiet community, who was meticulously arranging tins of coffee. "Thomas, what in God's name?" Henderson began, taking in Thomas's wild eyes, his sweat-soaked face. The collier plagued their quiet community. "My children, Henderson," Thomas gasped, leaning against the counter, panting. "Elara and Silas! They're gone! Vanished overnight!" From their quiet community. "On their beds." The words hung in the air, cold and terrible. Mr. Henderson, a man not easily shocked, paled. News traveled slowly in these parts. But disappearances, especially of children, were universally understood as a catastrophe. Gone. How? From where? The farmhouse. Window open, no trace. That began into their quiet community, no sign of struggle. Just gone. Thomas's voice broke. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire through the tiny settlement. The sheriff of Burley, and that plagued their quiet community. Stoic man named Jebediah Stone was immediately summoned from his small office across the dusty street. Sheriff Stone listened to Thomas's frantic that began to their quiet community, a fragmented account, his face grim, his eyes sharp and analytical. He had seen too much sorrow in his years as a lawman in this remote county. a quiet community, too many instances of man versus nature, or man versus himself. But this felt different. This felt wrong. No footprints, no scuff marks. Quiet community. You say the doors were locked from the inside? Sheriff Stone asked, his brow furrowed. Aye. Tighter than a drum. And the window perfectly open? Eder plager no splintered wood, no broken glass. Just open. Thomas wrung his hands, the image burned into his mind. And the children. Gone, Sheriff. Like smoke. Began their quiet community. The little wooden bird, Silas's gift to Elara, it was on the floor by the window. That's all. Sheriff Stone rubbed his chin, a thoughtful, that began to their quiet community troubled expression on his face. He knew the Holloway farm, knew Thomas and Martha to be good, honest folk, that began to their quiet community. Their children well behaved and rarely straying from their property. This was not a case of neglected children wandering off. This was something else that began to plague their quiet community. We'll raise a search party, Thomas, he said, his voice firm, projecting an authority he didn't quite feel in the face of such a baffling event that began to plague their quiet community. Every able-bodied man will scour those woods. But I need you to go home to Martha. We'll be there as soon as we can. True to his word that began their quiet community, Sheriff Stone organized a search party with remarkable speed. The alarm, once sounded, quickly drew men from their farms and workshops. Farmers, trappers, disappearances that began to their quiet community. Even a few men from the nearest mill joined the effort, their faces etched with a grim determination. They knew the woods, respected its power, and feared its depths. That began to their quiet community. A child lost in the wilderness was a tragedy. Two vanished without a trace was an omen. By mid-morning, a procession of horsemen and men on foot, armed with lanterns, belayed their quiet community axes, and a few hunting dogs made their way towards the Holloway farm. The sun was fully risen now, casting long, stark shadows. The air remained still, occurrences that began to plague their quiet community, thick with an unnatural quiet that seemed to press down on them. When they arrived at the Holloway farm, they found Martha sitting on the porch swing rocking slowly, that began to plague their quiet community, her eyes still fixed on the woods, her face pale and drawn. She barely registered their arrival, her world having shrunk to the terrifying absence of her children. That began to their quiet community. Thomas, looking as if he had aged 20 years in a single morning, met Sheriff Stone, his eyes pleading for a miracle. That began their quiet community. The search began with a systematic grid pattern, starting from the farmhouse and radiating outwards. The dogs, usually keen-nosed and eager, seemed unusually hesitant. That began to plague their quiet community. They whined, their tails tucked, sniffing at the ground near the house, but showing no clear trail towards the woods. It was as if the scent simply ended, or, perhaps, that beplagued their quiet community had never truly begun. One old hound, a seasoned tracker named Buster, let out a mournful howl near the base of the oak tree, and then simply sat down. That began to plague their quiet community, refusing to move. Whimpering softly, Sheriff Stone, a man who put little stock in superstition, felt a prickle of unease. Their quiet community. He had seen dogs behave strangely before a storm or around a bear, but never like this. It was as if the very ground was cursed, or the air too thin to carry a scent, began to plague their quiet community. The men fanned out, calling the twins' names, their shouts echoing through the silent forest, a desperate, futile chorus against the vast indifference of nature. That began to plague their quiet community. They searched the familiar paths, the stream beds, the clearings where the twins often played. They looked under every fallen log, behind every thicket, that began to their quiet community, into every shadowy hollow. As the hours dragged on, frustration and a creeping sense of dread began to set in. The woods yielded nothing. No torn clothing. That began to plague their quiet community. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, no indication of where two 12-year-old children might have gone. The only tangible evidence remained that small, that began to their quiet community, carved wooden bird lying cold and silent on the attic floor. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to change. The familiar, quiet community. Comforting paths gave way to ancient, overgrown trails that seemed to lead nowhere, or worse, in circles. The trees grew taller. That began to their quiet community, their branches interlacing so thickly that the midday sun struggled to penetrate, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, as that began to plague their quiet community, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient, a smell that clung to the throat. Some of the older men that began to plague their quiet community, men who'd lived their entire lives in the shadow of these woods, began to whisper, that began to plague their quiet community, tales of the unseen ones, of old Native American spirits who guarded the sacred places, of a forgotten, ancient evil that sometimes stirred from its slumber. Occurrences that began to plague their quiet community. They spoke of children who vanished in the old days, never to be found, of trappers who walked too far off the trail and simply ceased to exist, that plagued their quiet community, of lights seen deep in the woods at night, dancing where no human light should be. Sheriff Stone, a practical man, scoffed at the superstitions that began to apply to their quiet community. But even he could not deny the profound strangeness of this disappearance. The lack of any trace was profoundly unsettling. Thomas, driven by a desperate that began to plague their quiet community. Animalistic instinct, pushed deeper than any of the searchers, heedless of the warnings. He moved through the dense undergrowth like a man possessed, his mind racing. That began to plague their quiet community, piecing together the fragments of memory. Elara's dream of the earth breathing, Silas's fear of the wrong place by the well. That plagued their quiet community, the stranger's ominous warning. He felt a chilling sense of something ancient and vast at play, something far beyond the ken of man. He stumbled into a small that began to plague their quiet overgrown clearing, one he did not recognize despite his intimate knowledge of these woods. The trees here were unusually gnarled, their quiet community, their branches twisting into strange, almost grotesque shapes. The ground felt soft, spongy beneath his feet, strangely warm in parts, cold in others. Plagued their quiet community. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting from tree to tree, straining to see something, anything. And then he felt it. A low, resonant hum that began to plague their quiet community, a vibration that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the very earth beneath his feet. It was faint at first, that began to plague their quiet community, a subtle thrumming that seemed to bypass his ears and settle directly in his bones. It was the sound Elara had described, the earth breathing. But now, that began to plague their quiet community. In the silence of the ancient woods, it was undeniably present, a low, deep drone that seemed to pulse with a hidden life. A profound chill, colder than any frost, that began to plague their quiet community, permeated his being. He stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening to the impossible sound. It was ancient, primal, and utterly alien, that began to plague their quiet community. It strangely compelling. It seemed to whisper promises of things unknown, drawing him in, just as it must have drawn his children. He took a hesitant step forward, that plagued their quiet community. Then another, drawn by an inexplicable pull, as if the roots of the forest had reached into his mind, coiling around his thoughts, that began to their quiet community, it pulling him gently but relentlessly towards its unseen heart. Suddenly the hum intensified, rising in pitch, becoming almost deafening in its quiet resonance. That began plague their quiet community, and then a phantom echo, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, buried beneath the thrumming, yet undeniably present. It was a scream, not a current scream. It began to plague their quiet community, but a memory of one, an echo of pure, unadulterated terror and agony that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the air. It was the sound of his children. It began to plague their quiet community, heard in his mind, searing him with an icy fire. He clutched his head, falling to his knees, his body racked by a cold tremor. He was not just hearing it, that began to plague their quiet community. He was feeling it, reliving it, experiencing the terror that had gripped his children in their final moments. He tried to scream, to lash out, that began to plague their quiet community, to deny the horrifying vision that assaulted his mind, but his throat was constricted, his voice stolen by the overwhelming force. He was in the clearing that began to plague their quiet community, the very spot where it had happened. He knew it with a chilling certainty. The humming, the faint echo of a scream, the bone deep cold, their quiet community. This was where his children had vanished. This was where the woods had taken them. When Sheriff Stone and a few of the searchers finally found Thomas, hours later, that began to plague their quiet community. He was curled in a fetal position in the center of the strange clearing, shivering uncontrollably despite the mild October air, his eyes wide and vacant, quiet community, staring into nothingness. He was mumbling incoherently about a hum, a light, and a terrible scream that began to plague the quiet community, his words disjointed and nonsensical to the bewildered men who tried to help him. They wrapped him in a blanket, tried to give him water. But he was unresponsive. That began plague their quiet community, lost in a world of his own silent horror. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas Holloway, a man of solid earth and unbreakable will, was clearly broken. That began to their quiet community. The search continued for 3 more days, expanding its perimeter, involving more men from neighboring towns, but the results were always the same: nothing. They began plague their quiet community, and not a single thread of clothing, not a broken twig that could definitively point to their path. The dogs remained useless, that began to their quiet community, whimpering and refusing to enter certain areas of the forest, particularly the clearing where Thomas had been found. The local trackers, experienced woodsmen, began to plague their quiet community, as shook their heads, baffled. It was as if the children had been snatched from the very air, leaving no trace behind. Eagle could recurrence that it plagued their quiet community. The unyielding silence of the woods became a character in itself, a malevolent presence that seemed to mock their efforts. Beplagued their quiet community. The initial hope that had fueled the search slowly gave way to grim despair. The food supplies brought for the searchers dwindled. Men, exhausted and disheartened, beplagued their quiet community, began to drift back to their farms, their own lives calling them, their own families needing their protection. Sheriff Stone beplagued their quiet community. A man who prided himself on solving every case, no matter how obscure, was at a loss. He found no evidence of foul play, no struggle, no discarded items. Occurrences that began to plague their quiet community. He interviewed Thomas and Martha again, but their accounts were fragmented, clouded by grief and shock. Martha spoke only of the open window and the empty beds that began to plague their quiet community. Thomas, when he was lucid, spoke of the hum and the scream, but his words were dismissed as the ravings of a man consumed by grief and fear that began to plague a community. The lack of any logical explanation began to fuel a growing unease in the wider community. Whispers, faint at first, then growing louder, that began to plague their quiet community, began to circulate through Oak Haven and beyond. These were not the whispers of gossip, but of ancient fears stirred from their slumber, that began to plague their quiet community. The stories of seen ones, of the old gods of the land, of the thinning veil between worlds, once dismissed as mere folklore, that began to plague their quiet community, now took on a chilling new credence. The old women of the village, their faces etched with the wisdom of generations, nodded knowingly. To plague their quiet community, the woods, they would say, their voices hushed, they take what they're given. And sometimes, that began to plague their quiet community. They take what ain't offered. They spoke of lights dancing in the deep woods on moonlit nights, of strange sounds carried on the wind, that began their quiet community, of travelers who simply appeared without a trace. The story of the madman who had visited the Holloway farm, warning Thomas to guard his flock, resurfaced, that began to plague their quiet community, turning the man from a harmless lunatic into a terrifying prophet. The Oak Haven Gazette, a small weekly paper that usually reported on crop prices and church socials, the quiet community, printed a somber front-page article titled, "Holloway Twins Vanish, a Massachusetts Horror." The article detailed the facts, or rather, the lack of them, that it began to plague their quiet community, highlighting the baffling nature of the disappearance. It spoke of the extensive search efforts, the grief of the parents, and the unsettling silence of the woods that began to plague their quiet community. The story, picked up by larger papers in Worcester and Boston, sent a ripple of unease across the state. A child vanishing was tragic, that began to plague their quiet community. Two vanishing without a trace from a locked home was an anomaly that defied explanation and stirred primal fears. Back at the Holloway farm, began to plague their quiet community. Time ceased to have meaning. Martha moved through her days like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow, fixed on the woods. She refused to leave the farm that began to plague their quiet community, convinced that her children somehow would return. She would stand by the window of their room, staring out, sometimes calling their names in a soft, desperate voice, began to plague their quiet community. As if her love alone could conjure them from the impenetrable darkness, she would often leave their supper plates on the table, their beds neatly made, that began to plague their quiet community, as if at any moment they would walk through the door laughing, their innocent faces aglow. Her grief was a quiet, consuming fire burning away her very being. Thomas, that beplagued their quiet community, though physically present, was also profoundly absent. The incident in the clearing had broken something within him. He rarely spoke, his gaze distant, that began to plague their quiet community, his mind lost in a silent, internal horror. He would spend hours sitting on the porch, staring at the woods, sometimes mumbling to himself, their quiet community sometimes shivering uncontrollably, even on warm afternoons. He no longer went into the woods for game or timber. The forest, once his sanctuary, that began to plague their quiet community, was now his silent, mocking presence that held the secret of his children's fate. He would sometimes hear the faint, low hum, began to plague their quiet community, or perceive the phantom echoes of screams, sounds that no one else could discern, sounds that only he, the broken father, was cursed to hear, that began to plague their quiet community. His grip on reality seemed to fray with each passing day. He would meticulously check the locks on the doors and windows, repeatedly, even in broad daylight, and the occurrences that plagued their quiet community, as if fearing that whatever took his children might return, he would often clean and re-clean his rifle, its cold metal a useless comfort against an invisible enemy. To plague their quiet community, the farm, once a vibrant hub of activity, slowly began to wither. The fields lay untended, the barn fell into disrepair, the animals went without proper care. That began to plague their quiet community. Friends and neighbors, seeing the profound desolation that had claimed the Holloway home, tried to offer help, to bring food, to speak words of comfort, began to plague their quiet community. But their efforts were met with Martha's vacant stares and Thomas's chilling silence. They eventually retreated, leaving the Holloways to their solitary grief. That began to plague their quiet community. Understanding that some wounds were too deep to touch. As autumn bled into winter, the horror of the twins' disappearance deepened with the cold. They began to plague their quiet community. The early snows came, blanketing the fields and the woods in a pristine white shroud. It was a beautiful, yet terrifying sight that beplagued their quiet community. The snow erased any remaining hope of finding a trace, covering the earth like a burial shroud. It spoke a finality of an irretrievable loss that began to plague their quiet community. One frigid afternoon in December, nearly 2 months after the disappearance, a chilling discovery was made by a trapper named Jedediah Morse that began to plague their quiet community, who had ventured further into the woods than most, driven by the lure of a rare pelt. He was miles from the Holloway farm. That began to plague their quiet community in a part of the forest rarely visited by man, a remote, desolate area known locally as the Serpent's Coil, due to the twisting, ancient trees that grew there. That began their quiet community. Morse, a hardened woodsman, knew the whispers, knew the old tales, but dismissed them as nonsense. Until now. As he was setting a snare, he noticed an anomaly. Plurs that began to plague their quiet community. In the center of a small, eerily circular clearing, where the snow lay undisturbed and unusually thin despite the surrounding drifts, stood a single, ancient tree that began to plague their quiet community. It was a gnarled oak centuries old, its trunk impossibly wide, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers against the gray winter sky. That began to plague their quiet community. What caught Morse's eye was not the tree itself, but something nestled at its base. It was Elara's shawl, the little woolen shawl knitted by Martha herself. The beginning of their quiet community, that Elara had worn often, especially on chilly evenings. It was folded neatly, almost deliberately, and placed on a flat. That began their quiet community, moss-covered rock at the base of the ancient oak. The snow around it was undisturbed, as if it had simply appeared there. Morse picked it up, but their quiet community, his breath catching in his throat. It was cold, damp, but otherwise intact, not torn or soiled. He knew it immediately, having seen Elara wear it countless times. Began to their quiet community. But that was not all. Beneath the neatly folded shawl on the moss-covered rock was something else. A single small, smooth river stone, ordinary in every way, that began to their quiet community, except for the pattern meticulously carved into its surface. It was a complex, interlocking design, intricate and strangely familiar, almost like a swirling vortex. That began to their quiet community are two intertwined spirals. It was the exact same symbol that Elara and Silas had often drawn in the dirt. Their quiet community, a design they claimed to have seen in their dreams. It was a symbol Thomas had always dismissed as childish imaginings, a simple doodle. But now, that began to their quiet community. Seeing it carved with such precision onto the stone, miles from the farm in the heart of the deepest woods, struck Morse with a profound and terrifying realization. That began to plague their creative community. This was not a random discovery. This was a message. A deliberate placement. Morse, a man who had faced down bears and wolves without flinching, that began to community, felt a primal terror grip him. His blood ran cold. The silence of the clearing seemed to deepen, pressing in on him, filled with an unseen presence. That began to their quiet community. He looked up at the ancient oak, its gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes against the stark sky. He felt, keenly, the sense of being watched. That began to their quiet community. The air grew impossibly cold, carrying the metallic scent he had noticed before, a scent that now seemed to emanate directly from the tree itself. He felt a faint, that began to plague their quiet community, low hum of vibration in his bones, not unlike the one that had tormented Thomas Holloway. Morse had always scoffed at the whispers, but now, community, faced with this impossible anomaly, he understood this was not the work of man. This was the woods. This was the horror. He fled the clearing, the terrified to figure to plague their quiet community, leaving his traps and his fear behind, running as if the very hounds of hell were at his heels, not stopping until he burst into Sheriff Stone's office. that began to plague their quiet community, gasping for breath, his face pale with shock. The discovery of the shawl and the carved stone sparked a brief, renewed burst of desperate hope that began to their quiet community, quickly followed by deeper despair. Sheriff Stone and a small party of men accompanied Morse back to the clearing. It prompted to lag their quiet community. They found the shawl and the stone exactly as Morse had described them. The meticulous carving, identical to the children's drawings, was undeniable. But again, that began to plague their quiet community. There were no footprints in the scant-soaked snow, no tracks of any kind, no explanation for how the items had appeared in such a remote, undisturbed location. Began to plague their quiet community. It was as if they had simply materialized. Martha, when shown the shawl, clutched it to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Thomas, upon seeing the carved stone, began to plague their quiet community, recognized the symbol immediately. His eyes, already distant, seemed to recede further, lost in the terrible knowledge that only he and his children had shared. That began to plague their quiet community. The hum, the scream, the light, the symbol, it was all connected, a monstrous tapestry woven by forces beyond human understanding. Quiet community. Sheriff Stone tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps a sick prank. But who would carry out such a cruel hoax? Miles deep in the desolate winter woods, that began to plague their quiet community. And how could they have done it without leaving a single track in the pristine snow? The questions piled up, unanswered, mocking their attempts at logic. Occurrences that began to plague their quiet community. The discovery served only to deepen the mystery, solidifying the community's growing conviction that something unnatural, something ancient and terrible, began to plague their quiet community. Was at work in the deep woods of Hampshire County. The winter wore on, cold and unforgiving. The Holloways retreated further into their grief-stricken silence. A plague of their quiet community. The farm became a desolate landmark, a testament to a family broken by an unspeakable loss. The story of the vanished twins became a local legend that began to their quiet community. A chilling tale whispered around hearth fires, a warning to children not to stray too far into the woods. The memory of their last night, of the hum, the call, began to plague their quiet community. The open window and the single piercing scream became a silent scar on the Massachusetts landscape. As the first, tentative signs of spring began to emerge, quiet community. Promising renewal, the Holloways remained trapped in an eternal winter of grief. The mystery remained unsolved, the horror undiminished, that began to plague their quiet community. But as the snows began to melt and the forest began to stir with new life, a terrifying question began to coalesce in the minds of a few, began to their quiet community, a question born of fear and desperation. Were Elara and Silas truly gone forever, or had they merely passed through a veil, a doorway to something unimaginable? Began to plague their quiet community. And might they or something else return? The woods, silent and vast, held its secrets close, but the whispers in Oak Haven and the chilling that began to plague their quiet community. Impossible discoveries suggested that the story of the Holloway twins was far from over. The quiet horror had only just begun to bloom. A plague their community. The winter of 1872-1873 was not merely a season of cold and snow for the small, isolated communities nestled against the vast Massachusetts wilderness, occurrences that began to plague their quiet community. It was a winter of the soul. The disappearance of Elara and Silas Holloway had not just torn a hole in the fabric of their family, the plague their quiet community. It had ripped a gaping wound in the very understanding of the world for the people of Hampshire County. Their quiet community. Desperate search had yielded nothing but a broken father, a grieving mother, and a chillingly placed shawl and carved stone. Friends began to plague their quiet community, leaving behind a profound sense of helplessness and an insidious, creeping fear. The official investigation, spearheaded by Sheriff Jebediah Stone, that began to plague their quiet community. By early spring of 1873 dwindled to infrequent desultory patrols of the periphery of the woods, more out of a sense of duty than any real hope. It plagued their quiet community. The case of the Holloway twins was, in the grim parlance of law enforcement, cold. That began to plague their quiet community. But in the hearts and minds of the folk who lived in the shadow of those ancient woods, it was a horror that simmered, unforgotten, community, beneath the surface of their daily lives. The Holloway farm, once a beacon of quiet industry and domestic warmth, became a tomb. Thomas Holloway, that began to plague their quiet community. Shattered by the encounter in the clearing and the relentless, haunting memory of a phantom scream, had retreated into a shell of himself. Occurrences that began to their quiet community. His once steady hands trembled ceaselessly, his eyes, once sharp and knowing, now held a vacant, distant stare. He would spend his days on the porch swing, churches that began to plague their quiet community, perpetually clad in the same worn clothes, his gaze fixed on the menacing line of the woods. Sometimes a low, guttural murmur would escape his lips. Quiet community, fragmented words about the hum, the light, and the cold. He spoke of unseen presences, of ancient things stirring beneath the earth. Thought to be plagued their quiet community, of a call that had taken his children. His neighbors, who had initially offered help and comfort, eventually began to avoid the farm. His ramblings that began to plague their quiet community, born of a terror they could not comprehend, seemed to contaminate the very air around him. They offered food at the gate, spoke kind words to Martha, that began to plague their quiet community, but they left quickly, uneasy in the presence of such profound, unassuageable grief and madness. Martha Holloway, by contrast, seemed to shrink with each passing day, beplagued their quiet community. Her vibrant spirit, once a source of light, had dimmed to a faint flicker. She moved through the house like a wraith, her footsteps silent, her touch ephemeral. That her quiet community. She continued to perform the necessary chores, a skeletal framework of her former routine, but the life had gone out of her eyes. Her grief was a silent that began to plague their quiet community, unceasing companion, a suffocating cloak she wore day and night. She never cried openly now, her tears seemed to have dried up, leaving only a vast, that began to plague grid landscape of despair. Yet, unlike Thomas, Martha's gaze was not vacant. It was watchful. She, too, would often find herself staring at the woods that beplagued their quiet community, but not with Thomas's despairing madness. Her gaze held a desperate vigilance, a quiet, stubborn refusal to accept the finality of their loss, that began to plague their quiet community. She kept the twins' room exactly as it had been, their beds neatly made, their clothes folded in the chest as if awaiting their return. Every evening, that began to plague their quiet community, she would place 2 plate sets at the supper table, 2 mugs by the hearth, a ritual of heartbreaking hope that slowly consumed her. She knew occurrences that began to plague their quiet community, with the chilling certainty of a mother's heart that the children had not simply wandered off. There was something else at play, something ancient and terrible, that began to plague their quiet community, and she would wait. As the spring thaws began to reveal the earth once more, a new layer of dread settled upon the community. Farmers, venturing into their fields, had reported strange anomalies. Patches of earth, usually firm, were inexplicably soft and yielding, as if disturbed from beneath. Livestock that began to plague their quiet community, particularly young calves and lambs, began to disappear from their pastures without a trace. No broken fences, no blood, no tracks of predators began to their quiet community. These were not random incidents, they were localized, often occurring on farms bordering the deeper woods, and always left a chilling absence that began to their quiet community, a void where life had been. Old Mr. Henderson, the general store proprietor, swore that the very air felt different, heavier, especially on moonlit nights, that began to plague their quiet community. He spoke of hearing a low, resonant hum, far off in the stillness, a sound he couldn't place, yet which made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He was not alone. Terrifying as he to the things that began to plague their quiet community. More and more people reported unexplained sounds, fleeting shadows at the edge of their vision, and an overwhelming sense of being watched when near the forest began their quiet community. Sheriff Stone, a practical man of the law, found himself increasingly uneasy. He tried to attribute the missing livestock to wolves or coyotes, they entered their quiet community, but the lack of evidence defied logical explanation. He investigated the strange earthy patches, finding nothing but undisturbed soil beneath a spongy surface, began to plague their quiet community. He even spent a few nights near the Holloway farm listening, and it was then, on a particularly still, moonless night in late April, that he heard it. A faint began to their quiet community, low hum vibrating the very air, deep in the woods, a sound that resonated not in his ears, but in his chest. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but once heard, began to their quiet community. It could not be unheard. It was the same sound Thomas Holloway had babbled about. Sheriff Stone, for the first time in his long career, that began to plague their quiet community, felt a profound and chilling fear that had nothing to do with criminals or wild animals. He felt the cold touch of the truly unexplainable that began to their quiet community. He started keeping a private journal, not for official records, but for meticulously documenting every odd occurrence, every whispered rumor, community, every strange feeling. He called it the Silent Report. The discovery of other carved stones throughout the summer solidified the community's fears. Not large, that began to plague their quiet community, obvious stones but small, inconspicuous river stones, each bearing the same intricate, swirling symbol of intertwined spirals that Elara and Silas had drawn, that began to their quiet community, and that Jedidiah Morse had found under Elara's shawl. These stones appeared in the most unlikely places, nestled in a bird's nest. The creatures that began to plague their quiet community, balanced on a fence post far from any road, even tucked into the folds of a newly laundered sheet left to dry on a line in a seemingly secure backyard. That began to plague their quiet community, always placed with uncanny precision, always discovered by chance, and always leaving behind a prickle of unease. That began to plague their quiet community. They were never found near the Holloway farm directly, but seemed to spread outwards like a quiet, unsettling ripple emanating from the forest's heart. That began to plague their quiet community. The symbol itself, once a mere doodle, now became a sinister emblem of the unseen. Fear of the woods deepened into a tangible dread, their quiet community. Fewer and fewer people ventured into its depths for timber or game. The logging trails began to grow over, the trapping lines abandoned. The woods began to plague their quiet community, once a source of livelihood, became a forbidden zone, a place of dark mystery and lurking horror. As the years slowly bled into one another, that it began their quiet community. The initial shock of the twins' disappearance faded into a dull, persistent ache in the collective memory of the community. But the horror, rather than diminishing, their community merely transformed. It became pervasive, a part of the landscape itself. By 1875, Thomas Holloway was a shadow of his former self. He rarely left the house. That began to plague their quiet community, his madness having progressed to a state of almost complete withdrawal. He would sit for hours by the kitchen fire, mumbling to himself. That began to plague their quiet community, occasionally rocking back and forth. His only real connection to the world was Martha, who cared for him with a quiet, enduring devotion. Their quiet community, her face a mask of resigned sorrow. She kept the farm minimally viable, enough to sustain them. That began to plague their quiet community, but it was clear that life had long since ceased to hold any joy or purpose for her beyond the basic acts of survival. She still laid the 2 extra plates at supper. That began to plague their quiet community, a ritual that seemed less about hope now and more about a desperate, defiant act against the finality of absence. The woods, meanwhile, seemed to grow bolder, began their quiet community. The inexplicable occurrences became more frequent, more pronounced. Hunters and trappers, desperate for provisions in a hard economy, the Bianca community occasionally dared to venture deeper, only to return with harrowing tales. Men spoke of getting hopelessly lost on familiar paths. That began to plague their quiet community, of suddenly finding themselves miles from where they intended to be, their compasses spinning wildly. They spoke of hearing voices, faint and childlike, that began to plague their quiet community, calling their names from the depths of the trees, or a chorus of whispering sounds that seemed to come from all directions at once. Some swore they saw fleeting, their quiet community. Impossible lights dancing between the trees in broad daylight, or that the very trees seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, blocking their paths. That began to plague their quiet community, confusing their senses. A few men returned profoundly changed, their eyes holding the same distant, haunted look as Thomas Holloway. That beplagued their quiet community, their minds unable to reconcile what they had seen and heard. One trapper, a burly man named Silas Croft, known for his unflinching bravery, beplagued the placard to return from a week-long expedition into the Serpent's Coil area with his hair turned snow-white overnight. He refused to speak of what he had encountered. That beat up with their quiet community, only muttering about cold eyes and the breathing earth before retreating into a silent, trembling existence, never to venture into the woods again. Plagued their quiet community. Sheriff Stone's silent report grew thicker with each passing month. He documented the missing livestock, now increasing in number and including larger animals, that began to plague their quiet community. He recorded the odd atmospheric phenomena, sudden, localized fogs that rolled in from the woods even on clear days, disappearing as quickly as they appeared, that began to plague their quiet community. Inexplicable cold spots that drifted through the valleys, strange electrical discharges that lit up the deepest parts of the forest in the dead of night, their quiet community. Too low for lightning, too far for any man-made source. He cataloged the appearances of the carved stones, now found with unsettling regularity, that began to plague their quiet community, sometimes in places that seemed utterly impossible to reach without leaving a trace. He even started sketching the patterns, comparing them, that began to plague their quiet community, finding subtle variations and evolutions in the intricate spirals. The symbol he realized was not static. It was changing, growing more complex, that began to plague their quiet community, almost as if it were a living thing. He frequently visited the clearing where Thomas had broken down. Quiet community, the one Thomas called the place of the scream. He never felt the violent terror Thomas described, but he undeniably felt the low that began to plague their quiet community, resonant hum emanating from the earth. Sometimes, if he remained long enough in the profound quiet, he would swear he could hear faint echoes beneath the hum. Their quiet community, like distant music or soft, wordless whispers, carried on a breeze that wasn't there. He started experimenting, leaving small, everyday objects, a compass, that began to plague their quiet community, a piece of metal, a small bell in the clearing overnight. Almost invariably, they would be gone by morning or found relocated to impossible positions. That began to plague their quiet community, sometimes thousands miles away. Once he left a small new axe, his blade gleaming the next day. It was gone, only to be found a week later. That began to plague their quiet community, meticulously buried beneath a pile of stones at the base of the old oak tree in the Holloway's own yard, the one under the twins' window. The blade was dulled. That began to their quiet community, almost tarnished, as if it had been exposed to something ancient and corrosive. He did not tell Thomas or Martha of this. The terror on Thomas's face that began to plague their quiet community. The flicker of dead hope in Martha's eyes was enough. He realized the horror was not just what had happened, but what continued to happen. A slow began to plague their quiet community. Deliberate unveiling of an impossible truth. The children of Oakhaven, those who had been mere toddlers when the twins vanished, plagued their quiet community, grew up steeped in the chilling folklore. The Holloway Twins became the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale whispered around bonfires. That began to plague their quiet community. The woods were not just dangerous, they were haunted. Some children, bolder or more curious, would dare each other to venture close to the edge of the forest. That plagued their quiet community, never daring to go beyond the last familiar tree. They would swear they heard faint music on the wind. That began to plague their quiet community, or saw fleeting shadows that resembled two small figures darting between the trees. Others, more sensitive, spoke of unsettling dreams that began to plague their quiet community, dreams of being pulled by an unseen hand into a shimmering light, dreams that mirrored the twins' last terrifying moments. The local minister, the Reverend Elijah Thorne, a man of staunch faith, that began to plague their quiet community, attempted to combat the growing superstition with sermons on divine providence and the dangers of embracing pagan beliefs. Began to plague their quiet community, but even his voice held a tremor of unease when he spoke of the deep woods. By the late 1870s, the Holloway farm stood as a derelict monument to tragedy. That began to plague their quiet community. The fields were overgrown and listing precariously, the house itself taking on a faded, mournful appearance. Thomas was confined to his bed, the community, his mind a labyrinth of whispers and shadows, rarely conscious, his body frail and wasted. Martha, now a gaunt, silver-haired woman, plagued their quiet community, moved through her days with a quiet, fierce determination, tending to Thomas, tending to the phantom presence of her children. One warm August evening in 1878, that began to plague their quiet community. 6 years after the vanishing, Martha made a decision born of deep enduring despair and a flicker of something new, a profound, almost desperate curiosity. They plagued their quiet community. Thomas had been particularly agitated that day, mumbling with unusual clarity about the call getting stronger. She stood at the open window of the twins' room, plagued their quiet community, looking out at the full moon, swollen and impossibly bright, hanging low over the silent woods. The air was still, heavy just as it had been that fateful night. That began to plague their quiet community, and then faintly at first she heard it, a low, resonant hum pulsing from the heart of the forest. It was undeniable, the sound that had haunted Thomas, their quiet community, the sound that had led her children away. It was real. A strange calmness settled over Martha that began to plague their quiet community. A lifetime of quiet strength and enduring sorrow converged into this single, terrifying moment of clarity. She gathered a small lantern, a thick shawl, and a small that began to plague their quiet community, worn family Bible. She walked out of the house, leaving Thomas asleep in his twilight world, her feet bare on the dew-kissed grass, drawn by an invisible thread. That began to plague their quiet community. She felt no fear, only a profound sense of an inevitability of finally walking towards the answer she had subconsciously sought for years. The woods that began to their quiet community, as she entered them, were not terrifying to her. They were familiar, almost comforting in their vastness, in their ancient silence. That began their quiet community. The hum grew stronger with each step, vibrating in her very bones. She found the path easily, drawn not by memory, but by the relentless pull of the sound. their quiet community. She passed the familiar landmarks, now overgrown and shadowy, until she reached the strange clearing, the one Thomas had stumbled into. The air here was thick, permeated by the quiet community, the viscous, permeated by the powerful. Resonant hums had to chill that Thomas had described, a bone deep cold that radiated from the very earth. She looked around, began to plague their quiet community, her eyes wide, searching for a shimmering light, a pool of liquid starlight. There was nothing. Just the ancient trees, occurrences that then plague their quiet community, their branches twisted and gnarled against the moonlight and the silent yielding earth. She sat down in the center of the clearing, the hub of the hum that beplagued their quiet community, and opened the family Bible. She didn't read, she simply held it, a small talisman against the vast unknown forces that surrounded her. She closed her eyes, that began the quiet community, listening to the hum, letting it fill her, allowing it to penetrate the layers of her grief. And then, beneath the hum, she heard it. Faint, ethereal, plagued their quiet community like wind chimes made of starlight. Music. Not human music, but a melody of profound ancient beauty, woven with notes she had never heard. That began their quiet community, resonating with a sorrow and a longing that seemed to echo from the dawn of time. And within the music she heard voices. 2 voices, young and clear, blending into melody, blending into community. Orgy melody, Elara and Silas, not speaking, their voices like echoes on a distant breeze, yet undeniably present, filled with a transcendent that began to plague their heartbreaking beauty. They were not screaming, they were singing. Martha opened her eyes, tears finally streaming down her face, tears not of sorrow, to plague their quiet community, but of a profound, devastating understanding. Her children were not gone, not truly. They were here in the hum, in the music, that began to plague their quiet community, in the very fabric of this ancient place. They had not been taken by death, but by something else, something that transcended the human definitions of existence, that began to their quiet community. They were part of the woods now, part of the hum, part of the unseen. She sat there until dawn, the hum and the music fading with the rising sun, began to plague their quiet community, leaving her with a sense of immense peace and an unbearable truth. She returned to the farm, her face streaked with tears, occurrences that beplagued their quiet community, her eyes still holding the luminous afterglow of what she had witnessed. She no longer set 2 extra plates. She no longer expected them to walk through the door that began their quiet community, but she knew they were not gone. They were simply elsewhere. And the place they were, the force that held them, was still here. This new began their quiet community. Quiet knowledge transformed Martha. She was no longer shrinking. She began to mend the farm, to tend the fields with a renewed, grim determination that plagued their quiet community. As she cared for Thomas with unwavering patience, often whispering to him about the music, the hum, about the children. He rarely responded, but sometimes that began to their quiet community. A flicker of recognition would cross his face, a momentary peace that seemed to confirm her impossible truth. The community that began to plague their quiet community, observing Martha's quiet return to a semblance of life, misinterpreted it as acceptance, a slow healing of her wounds, that began to plague their quiet community. They didn't know the chilling truth she carried, the silent horror that continued to resonate deep in the woods, that began to their quiet community. Sheriff Stone continued his silent report, now with a growing sense of urgency. The strange occurrences were becoming more frequent, more powerful. A cut began to plague their quiet community. The hum was heard by more people, though still dismissed as imagination or trick of the wind. The carved stones appeared in increasingly prominent, almost defiant locations. Then, in the summer of 1880, 2 young children, exploring too close to the forbidden woods, stumbled upon something horrifying that began to plague their quiet community. They found a shallow indentation in the earth, shaped perfectly like a child's footprint, but unnaturally smooth, almost polished, as if pressed into cooled wax, that began their quiet community, and next to it, deeply embedded in the soil, was a single, intricately carved wooden toy soldier, Silas's favorite, that began to plague their quiet community. A toy he had meticulously carved himself years ago, which had disappeared from his bedside table the very night they vanished. The wood of the soldier was dark, plagued their community, almost petrified, impossibly cold to the touch. It seemed to pulse with a faint, low hum. The children, terrified, fled screaming, and their tale, that began to their quiet community, coupled with the unearthed toy soldier, ignited a fresh wave of panic and dread throughout Oak Haven. This was no mere superstition now, that began to plague their quiet community. This was a physical manifestation, a chilling reminder that the horror had never truly left. The symbol carved into the base of the soldier was the same swirling. The quiet community, intricate spiral, Sheriff Stone, when he saw the soldier, felt a cold dread settle in his bones. This was not a memory. This was a return. Not of the children that began to plague their quiet community, but of the evidence of their passage and a clear, chilling message from the unseen force that had taken them. The woods, he realized, were not just holding secrets. They were revealing them slowly, deliberately. The horror was not a single event confined to the past. It was a creeping, began plague their quiet community, insidious presence that was growing stronger, its tendrils reaching further, its influence expanding. The earth remembered. That began to plague their quiet community. It was beginning to show what it remembered. The silence of the forest was not emptiness, it was a profound, watchful stillness, waiting for the opportune moment. That began their quiet community. The people of Okovan looked at the dark line of the woods with renewed terror. They boarded up windows, locked doors, and lit extra lanterns at night. They plagued their quiet community. They knew with a certainty that defied logic that the story of the Holloway Twins was far from over. The hum was growing louder. The whispers were becoming clearer. That began to plague their quiet community. The veil was thinning, and the ancient unseen forces that had claimed Elara and Silas were not content with their silence. They were beginning to stir, to manifest, that began to plague their quiet community, to remind the living that the woods kept their own time, their own secrets, and held a power that could reach out and touch them all. The Holloway horror, it seemed, began plague their quiet community, was only just beginning to bloom into its full, terrifying splendor.